I'm very sorry, the translation machine was switched off. I'm very delighted to come to you to talk to you about some of our latest research from the Institute. I would like to visit you in person, but I'm really not willing to visit your virus-infested planet. So unfortunately, the electromagnetic spectrum will have to do. And what I want to do is to tell you today about a planet that we have recently discovered called Naknar Three. Now, after much investigation, our conclusions are that this planet is uninhabitable. And I want to tell you why that's the case. And I think you'll agree that it is in stark contrast to the great optimism that has been shown by many people for the habitability of this world. So today's lecture is about this distant world and its habitability. Is there life on Naknar 3? Is there life on Naknar 3? So first of all, let's remind ourselves of where Naknar 3 is. If you look up into the southern hemisphere, those of you who are amateur astronomers will be very familiar with this night sky. You will know that Naknar is a main sequence star found in the constellation Hunter on six-legged Ongi beast, there in the neck of the Hunter. And our recent studies using various exoplanet methods have given us some information about this planet orbiting the star Naknar. We think it's the third planet orbiting the star. Our exoplanet searches have shown a number of planets orbiting the star. This seems to be the third one out, and we've managed to gain some information about its characteristics. For example, we think that it's about 10,000 kilometers in diameter. That's based on the transit method, substantially larger than our own planet, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's likely to have a moon, we think an unusually large moon, and the consequences of that for the habitability of this world I will also come back to later. We've managed to do some spectroscopy, and we have some information about the atmospheric composition of this world. We think it's between about 15 and 35% oxygen. We're not quite sure what, that's a general range. And we also think it might contain this very, very strange gas called ozone, O3, made up of 3 oxygen atoms, extremely rarely observed on our own planet. In addition to this, we also observe high concentrations of nitrogen. There is water, good evidence for water in the atmosphere, and also small amounts of carbon dioxide in the planetary atmosphere. Now, there's been enormous press optimism, as I'm sure you're aware, and many people are very excited about the possibility that there might be life on Naknar 3. But in this talk, I want to introduce you to some of the reasons why it's unlikely to be a habitable world, or at least habitable for complex, intelligent life. First of all, the presence of high concentrations of this very unusual gas, oxygen, that I will talk about in a moment. The possibility of land movements on Naknar 3 that may prevent the possibility of complex life, the possibility of a very large moon which has implications for the possibility of the emergence of complex life on the planet, and also the very unusual levels of low radiation on the surface of the planet, which you can probably guess have profound implications for the possibility of the origin of life, let alone complex life, which I'll come back to in a moment. So let's look at these and try and understand why Naknar 3 is unlikely to be a place for complex life, let alone intelligence like us. So first of all, let's look at oxygen. This planet has very high concentrations of this very unusual gas that's at extremely low concentrations in our own planetary atmosphere. And we're not really sure where this oxygen comes from. It's a molecule made up of 2 oxygen atoms that you can see in the top right-hand side there. And there are a number of geological ways that could produce this strange gas. For example, some people have suggested that water might be reacting with ultraviolet radiation high in the atmosphere, breaking apart the water and releasing the oxygen that gathers in the atmosphere. That's a very speculative mechanism, never observed on our own world, but we think it might occur somewhere else. there may also be ancient oxygen sinks within that planet that are exhaling this oxygen from some ancient geological process or early oxidation reactions that we don't fully understand. And there may be other geological processes that are breaking apart carbon dioxide and water and producing oxygen. We really don't have a good grasp on the geology. Now, as this is an astrobiology lecture, of course, some people have suggested that there may be life on Naknar Three, splitting up the water and making oxygen. And this is an outlandish suggestion, very, very interesting. And as students, I want you to remember Zarzog's razor that says that we should always accept the explanation with the fewest number of assumptions. And Zarzog's razor would caution us to say that we probably don't understand the geology of Naknar Three, and we should accept our lack of understanding of those processes before resorting to a biological explanation. In other words, there's unlikely to be life on Naknar Three. It's probably that we don't understand the geology. But nevertheless, it's an interesting idea, this biological suggestion. So what might be the problem with high concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere of Naknar Three? Well, this is something that we've only recently investigated in this very novel field of chemistry called high oxygen chemistry. And some researchers have taken the molecules from which life is constructed, complex organic molecules, and they have exposed them to very high levels of oxygen, 1 or 2% concentrations of oxygen, and in some quite outlandish experiments, concentrations of tens of percent of this unusual gas that have been speculated as the upper bound of oxygen on Naknar Three. And the consequences of this are really profound. On the right-hand side, you can see some work that was recently undertaken by the group of Zarfan et al., and they showed that at 20% oxygen, this is a Naknar 3 simulation chamber, and in this simulated atmosphere, if you expose organic material to 20% oxygen and inject energy into the system, it spontaneously combusts, as you can see there. So even without going any further, I think we can say that Naknar 3 is uninhabitable simply because any organic material or life form present on that planet would likely combust. And this research has shown combustion in dry conditions, but even in organic material that has water in it, at 20 or 30% oxygen, it can spontaneously combust with sufficient energy. Naknar 3 is surely an uninhabitable world. However, that has not stopped some very speculative and interesting ideas about the possibility of life on Naknar 3. This, I think, is one of the most intriguing ideas, although you shouldn't take it too seriously. It was proposed by Professor Kulnar, and it's called the fire in the cell hypothesis. And the idea here is that organic material on this planet could be burned in oxygen, similar to those experiments I've just described, releasing the energy in the form of fire. And that fire energy could be used to do biological work. And the idea is that on Naknar 3, organisms would use this plentiful supply of oxygen to generate energy instead of using sulfates on our own world to make energy. This is the fire in the cell hypothesis, and you can see the paper in the bottom right-hand side there. So why would we think that this was a crazy idea? Well, have a think about some of the problems. How would you control that fire inside the cell? As we saw in those combustion chamber experiments, at tens of percent oxygen, life forms would be instantaneously combusted when they are exposed to energy. So there's no way that this energy would be controllable. No reactions are 100% efficient, so some of that energy, even if we could control it, is going to be dissipated and will likely consume the life form. So I think we can say that the fire in the cell hypothesis is an interesting idea, but it's highly unlikely. It's probable that this idea of burning things in this very unusual gas oxygen is simply too uncontrollable. However, there have been some suggestions. Professor Kulnar has come back to the scientists who have questioned his idea with some speculative ways in which life could overcome this problem. For example, it could have on its outside radiative fins that would dissipate the intense energies given off by the fire in the cell reactions. But then you'd have to ask yourself, what could these fins possibly be made from? What plausible material would allow the heat to be dissipated without themselves being consumed? He's also suggested that reactions could occur in special fire-resistant organelles, and the idea here is that within the cell there would be organelles, for example, made of silica, that would control these fiery reactions and prevent the energy from consuming the life form. Again, we do not observe such organelles in life on our own planet. Why would we think they would be observed on Naknar 3, or how could they even evolve in such an environment? Another suggestion is that the reactions could be done in very small quanta. Small amounts of organic carbon would be burned in this oxygen gas to release energy, but only small amounts at a time. That's an interesting idea. It has some parallels with our own biochemistry, but the energies released would be so great that it would be very difficult to think of a reaction that could occur where there would be a sufficient level of control. And then a final idea is that there might be special catalysts in the life on Naknar 3 that would allow for the fire in the cell reactions to be controlled. Again, interesting ideas, but very, very little support from laboratory work, and certainly no parallels in our own biology. However, we should, for the sake of completeness, discuss some intriguing ideas about the benefit that might be obtained from burning organic material in oxygen. So in the top part of the slide, you can see the reaction on our own world where we burn organic material in sulfates, such as gypsum cubes, to generate our energy, and that is how we get our energy on a day-to-day basis. On Naknar 3, the sulfate has been replaced with oxygen, allowing for this intense fire reaction. Now, Zog's free energy, we can calculate this to work out the amount of energy produced by these reactions, and if you do that, what you'll discover is that on Naknar 3, the energy released, the Zog's free energy released, would be about 10 times the energy of sulfate reduction on our own world. And some scientists have, I would say, entertainingly suggested that this would mean that life on Naknar 3 would only have to eat now and then, possibly even once or twice a day, instead of every few minutes on our own world. And that's a fun speculation, not very serious, but I think that we can probably conclude that the Zog's free energy released from the use of oxygen would be so intense that overall this is not really a very plausible idea. Now, going on from this, we might also notice some further research that has been carried out under high oxygen concentrations, demonstrating that this oxygen molecule can be broken down into reactive oxygen states that will react with any material from which a life form is made. And this new area of research studies the consequences of these high oxygen concentrations on Naknar 3. And in the bottom part of this slide, you can see some of these strange oxygen molecules generated from this intensely reactive gas. And the idea here is that these molecules would react with organic material and break them down. On Naknar 3, molecules in life would be constantly destroyed by this very strange gas. So we don't even have to speculate about the overproduction of energy from burning organic material and oxygen to realize that the molecule itself, independent of any energy production, would destroy life through these highly damaging chemical oxidant reactions. And this leads us to the conclusion that it's not possible to produce a life form in an atmosphere with such high concentrations of this oxygen gas. This is some work that was done recently by some of our researchers showing what happens when you break down this unusual oxygen gas and you mix it with the protons, the strings of amino acids that make up some of our biomolecules. And under the influence of these highly reactive oxygen states, protons are very quickly destroyed. And this is a pathway of the way in which protons are broken down into their constituent molecular structures ultimately destroying a life form, destroying the molecules from which life is constructed. So this is further research showing you how life in an atmosphere of tens of percent oxygen couldn't possibly be sustained over even the shortest periods of time. This is a very intriguing idea, life in oxygen, but really not sustainable on many levels. Now, I also want to tell you about an idea that has recently come about in our institute called the theory of moving land. Now, we have managed to get some idea of the size of Naknar Three. We think it's about 10,000 kilometers in diameter compared to our own planet, just over 7,500 kilometers, much bigger. And what's interesting is that when you analyze the size of this planet and you carry out some modeling work, you discover that this planet is so large that the internal heat would cause the surface of the planet to move around in giant slabs of rock. And here's a very fun paper that I've listed here, but don't take it too seriously, called Do Some Exoplanets Have Moving Land? And the idea is that this theory of moving land involves the shifting around of huge plates of rock on the surface of these distant worlds. Now, what would happen on a world where the surface rocks are moving around? Well, of course, as we all know, on the surface of our own world, the ancient gypsum mounds that were formed in the early history of our planet supplied the sulfate for energy acquisition for the first microbes to arrive on our planet, and then ultimately complex life, and ultimately, of course, intelligence today. Of course, today, most of us eat our gypsum from the seas of Malark, where gypsum is harvested and farmed for our own production. But of course, as we know, before technological civilization, life on our planet depended upon the giant sulfate mounds that were generated in the early history of our planet. In the top right-hand side there, you can see a picture of some of these familiar gypsum mounds on which we all like to sit and have a picnic on a summer's day. However, on this distant Naknar Three, the idea is these moving land masses would actually push these giant slabs of rock into the planet, causing them ultimately to melt, thus destroying the sulfate beds. And if you carry out the modeling on this distant Naknar Three, what you find is that the suggestion is that the sulfate sheets would be destroyed in a few 100 million years. So yes, we could speculate that microbes could evolve in this planet in the first few 100 million years, but very quickly they would run out of sulfate and there would be no possibility of the evolution of complex life, let alone intelligent life. These sulfates would be transformed into sulfides and other inedible forms of sulfur, preventing the emergence of complex life. So the theory of land movements is an interesting idea, but it leads us to a conclusion that this is a very uninhabitable world. Some people, again, like the oxygen question, some people have suggested that there are some benefits to the possibility of moving land. For example, the moving around of these giant rocks would recycle elements like iron and carbon through this distant Naknar Three, as you can see schematically represented in the top right-hand side, improving the availability of nutrients on this planet. But we would have to ask ourselves, would this really be any better than volcanism? We know that on our own world, hotspot volcanism, bubbles of magma beneath the surface of our planet that erupt onto the surface of our world. You can see a photograph of a volcano on our own planet in the bottom left-hand side there. This is sufficient to generate turnover of the major nutrients necessary for life on our planet. The suggestion is that the theory of moving land would result in improvements to the cycling of elements on Naknar Three. So that's an interesting idea. Is it really necessary for life? I personally doubt it, but it's something worth bringing up. The theory of moving land in general suggests that Naknar Three would be uninhabitable to complex life and intelligence, and microbial life, if it had ever evolved there, would only have been sustained for a few 100 million years. There are other problems with the idea of moving land. The shifting land masses would cause changes in seas. If Naknar Three has seas, this would likely cause extinctions. We might also think about the effects on the climate. The movement of land on the surface of Naknar Three would generate movements in atmosphere and also in the hydrological cycle, radically changing the climate and making this planet a very unstable place to be. This would make it a very unstable place to be, and therefore single-cell life might be able to persist on that planet, but intelligent life almost impossible. Now, the exoplanet data, the study of transit and also microlensing, suggests that Naknar Three has an unusually large moon for a planet, a rocky planet of its size. What would be the consequences of having a large moon on life? Well, the consequences would almost certainly be very bad for life. Why is that the case? Well, some recent research in our institute suggests that a moon would stabilize the planetary axis. And as a result, the climate would become too constant. So when I spoke about the theory of moving land, I suggested that moving land masses would make the climate extremely unstable. The presence of a very large moon has exactly the opposite effect. It makes the climate too stable for life. So we go from one extreme to another, and we can see how Naknar Three is really a place that is unlikely to be able to support complex life. The reason that this is bad for life is because if the axis of the planet is stabilized by a moon and it doesn't change, organisms become highly adapted to specialist habitats. And therefore, whenever there are catastrophic climate changes like those caused by asteroid or comet impacts or sudden volcanism, those life forms, because they're so specialist, will immediately be made extinct by these extraordinary changes in the environment. In this slide, we can see an illustration of what I have just discussed. In the top left-hand side there, you can see the obliquity or the tilt of Naknar Three, which is predicted using models, computer models. And you can see the obliquity of that planet changes between, we think, about 20 or 35 degrees. Of course, we don't know much about this world, but something on that sort of order. But the important point is that a large moon is predicted to stabilize the tilt of the planet. As a consequence, species become very adapted to specialized habitats on that planet. Every time there is a sudden disaster, species will be killed because there aren't enough generalist organisms capable of surviving on this planet where habitats have become unchanging in the interior, at least, of continents. On the right-hand side here, we can see some indication of the theories that have been developed about the effects of a moon on habitats and on the diversity of life on Naknar Three. In the top right-hand side is the familiar graph that you can see of our own world, diversity over time. Often we have catastrophes, asteroid and comet impacts, volcanic eruptions, and these changes to our planet rapidly cause catastrophe, but then the biosphere rebounds very quickly. And that is because we live on a planet where the changing tilt of our world causes organisms to be very generalist, constantly being subjected to very regular environmental changes from polar to tropical temperatures, and as a result, they are able to survive these sudden, unexpected changes in the environment, such as an asteroid or comet-induced impact winter. And so diversity rebounds very quickly. In the bottom right-hand side here, you can see a speculation about the possibility of life on Naknar Three. And the idea here is that because organisms are so specialized, because there's a large moon making habitats very stable over time, every time there is a catastrophe, there is a huge loss of diversity, but there is never the ability to rebound to the previous levels of diversity. And ultimately, this specialization caused by a moon will cause the planet to run into extinctions, not just of whole species, but possibly of all complex life itself. So we can see here that although we don't know much about the effects of a large moon, we can be fairly certain that a large moon would cause a planet to become essentially uninhabitable to complex life. So a moon would cause other problems for life as well. We might imagine that a giant moon would cause tidal waves and great changes at the coastal margins of giant continents. We know that on our own planet, life emerged from the oceans onto the land masses and eventually became intelligent. On a planet with a moon, the regions around coasts would be very unstable. Giant tidal waves would come in and wash the areas of the coasts away, preventing life from successfully climbing up from the oceans onto the land. In other words, even if you could imagine oceanic life on Naknar Three, it's almost certainly the case that it would not be able to make the transition onto land, with profound consequences for the emergence of complex life and ultimately intelligence. Now here is an interesting speculation from one of our biologists. Don't take this too seriously. This is the idea that a moon, a large moon around a planet, would reflect sunlight from Naknar onto the surface of Naknar 3 and light up that planet sometimes during the night. And this light from the moon would essentially be a disaster for biology because, of course, organisms adapted to life during the dark would then become prey for other organisms. And the idea is that this light reflected from the moon would be highly unpredictable and very disruptive to evolution. Some people have countered that maybe organisms on Naknar 3 would be adapted to this moonlight and they would come out during the moonlight and move around during the light. But I think at that point we've really passed the boundaries of sane speculation. But nevertheless, it's interesting coffee table talk. Could there be moonlight on a distant exoplanet with a large moon to which biology would respond? That's an extraordinary, speculative and wild idea, but nevertheless something we could talk about over a pint of our ongi beast milk, but certainly not something that we would take too seriously. So in other words, a large moon is almost certainly negative for life, a bad thing for life. Now finally I want to discuss ultraviolet radiation on Naknar 3. This is the last part of the conditions on this planet that really make it uninhabitable. And this is a graph showing you the ultraviolet radiation on Naknar 3. On the x-axis is wavelength, on the y-axis on the left-hand side is the irradiance. And the red curve in this diagram is the extraterrestrial spectrum that reaches the top of our planet. And there you can see the familiar spectrum of ultraviolet radiation on the surface of our own world, Zarkan. And you'll all know that ultraviolet radiation from about 200 nanometers upwards reaches the surface of our planet. On the right-hand side there you can see a modeling prediction of what ultraviolet radiation might look like on Naknar 3. And this takes into account the oxygen and also the idea that the oxygen might be broken down into this very strange gas, ozone, that has 3 oxygen atoms. And the consequence of that is that researchers have shown that ozone can absorb ultraviolet radiation. And so the idea is on Naknar 3 there would be less ultraviolet radiation than on the surface of our own planet. And there you can see the spectrum going down to about 290 nanometers where it's cut off below. The blue line in this diagram shows you the absorption spectrum of typical organic material. So what would be the consequences of this very low ultraviolet radiation on Naknar 3? Well, you can probably guess already what the consequences are. For example, we think that ultraviolet radiation was very important in the origin of life and that it may have played a role in building the complex molecules from which you and I and all life on our planet is made. Without high levels of ultraviolet radiation, there would not be sufficient radiation for an origin of life. So we can probably state with some degree of confidence that any planet that has a high level of oxygen in its atmosphere is not a good place for the origin of life. It could never have really taken hold there. You'll also know that on the surface of Zarkan, ultraviolet radiation plays a very important part in our cycles of organic degradation. ultraviolet radiation breaks down dead organic material and allows it to be returned into the biosphere. On Naknar Three, because that ultraviolet radiation is so much less intense, we could imagine organic material collecting on the surface of that planet, and it would be really thick. You could imagine wading through huge mounds of organic material on Naknar Three. That would again, I think, prevent the evolution of complex organic life on that planet. And then finally, I've also mentioned ultraviolet radiation would not be sufficient to drive evolution on Naknar Three. You and I know that on the surface of our own planet, the high levels of ultraviolet radiation generate mutations in our biological molecules, and those mutations are important for driving the process of evolution. On Naknar Three, the very low levels of ultraviolet radiation would prevent evolution from being satisfactorily advanced. The number of mutations would be a lot lower, the speed of evolution would consequently be a lot lower, and as a consequence of that, it's unlikely that life would go from microbial to complex life, ultimately to intelligence. That vital mutational drive, that vital mutational mechanism that results from ultraviolet radiation would not be present on Naknar Three. So those are just three examples of the way in which low ultraviolet radiation on the surface of this distant exoplanet would be detrimental to the habitability of that planet, from the origin of life through to the breakdown of organic molecules, through to the very process of evolution would be stymied or prevented by this low ultraviolet radiation. So this is yet another reason for lack of habitability. So let me provide some summary to this lecture. Naknar Three has been investigated as an abode for life, and as I've said, the media are wildly speculative about this, saying that this is a distant world that could possibly support life, maybe even intelligence, and everyone's getting very excited about it. But as I hope I've shown you, there are good reasons to believe that Naknar Three is uninhabitable, or at least not a good planet for complex life. And these problems include the high levels of this odd gas, oxygen, that we've recently been investigating, the possibility of this strange theory of land movement, the presence of a large moon, and this very low ultraviolet radiation. And those are just four factors that I've presented to you that demonstrate that this planet is likely to be a very bad place for life. There are probably other ones as well. I don't want to be too negative. Of course, Naknar Three could conceivably be home for some single-celled life, but it's unlikely to have ever had complex life, and it certainly does not have intelligent life, despite the theoretical amount of energy that could be released from oxygen. So if we want to continue the search for extraterrestrial life, we should really continue to focus on anaerobic, sulfate-bearing worlds like our own as the best locations for life. These are the places with long-lived sulfate deposits that can give rise to microbial life, ultimately complex life, and ultimately intelligence. And here are some questions I want you to consider based on the lecture that I've just given you. Is our view of habitability skewed by a bias of conditions on our world, or does our world provide insights into universal conditions required for life? That's a very interesting question. I hope I've convinced you that sulfate anaerobic worlds are a necessary precondition for the emergence of complex life and intelligence, but you might like to think about other factors as well, and is the idea that we have of habitability skewed by what we already know? Are there a core set of universal requirements for the origin of life? I've spoken about the very low ultraviolet radiation on Naknar Three that has almost certainly prevented an origin of life on that planet, but what about other factors that might affect the origin of life? Do some planetary conditions merely modify the timing or nature of an inevitable origin of life? In other words, is the origin of life inevitable, or does it require certain conditions? And I hope I've convinced you that that ultraviolet radiation problem on Naknar Three is one reason why we might think that there are certain conditions that could prevent an origin of life. Are there a core set of requirements for the rise of intelligence? I think we can assume that sulfate is a necessary requirement for the emergence of intelligence, or at least sufficient sulfate to be able to generate complex life and ultimately intelligence. What about other factors, and would we find these factors elsewhere? And then finally, do some planetary conditions merely modify the timing or the nature of an inevitable rise of intelligence? I asked that question in 2 points up in the slide about the origin of life. What about the rise of intelligence? What conditions are necessary for the rise of intelligence? So Naknar Three, let's not get too enthusiastic about it. It's probably a dead world, but we should have a think about it. And I hope that this lecture has provided you with some insight into our understanding of habitability and how we can assess other planets as abodes for life. Thank you very much for joining me in this lecture. It has been a delight to project onto the surface of your world. I hope that the advance in your technical sophistication will allow you one day to rid your planet of its virus infestation. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and continue the search for alien life on other planets in the universe.